Great, thanks, James. Like you said, my name is Tommy Waddington. I work at the Boston Consulting Group. I think everyone should be able to hear me now. That's good. Very, very excited about this panel today. I think we're talking about a topic that not only affects Nigeria, actually affects the continent as a whole. I think this is a good case study just because of some of the activities that have been going on over the past couple of years. We have excellent panelists that would take us through that whole process. I graduated from Harvard Business School in 2012. I have an engineering background, so electrical engineering. And I think my passion for power really just comes from having lived in Nigeria for some months and years, which some of you might not be able to relate to, but power issues are very prominent. And it's sad when you come to the US and you don't even think about electricity. I'm interested. So anyway, we have a very engaging discussion here. I actually got to interact with a lot of these people when I was back at school. I wrote a piece on the power sector in Nigeria. And so I know they have wonderful insights, so please let's make this very engaging. And we'll sort of walk through a timeline to sort of orient everyone in case you're not as familiar with the process. And then we'll kick it off to some of the speakers. I think they're still working on the presentation. Okay, great. So, just high level. I think where we started was many years back, even before we came out of Nigeria. We started a company that was sort of supposed to deal with some of the electricity issues, which was the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria. If you sort of fast track to where things started getting more hectic, in 1972, there was something called the National Electricity Power Authority. And that's what some of my childhood days I remember as a never expect power always. In 2005, they announced some form of reform because I think it's been such an important issue to the country in terms of this development, and they did a lot of business. So I think the goals have been there for a while now, and I think we're starting to see some of the more detailed results of some of the actions that they took. So some of the reforms started in 2005, and then fast forward to 2006, they made really little progress through, there were some initiatives and developing some particular assets that they thought was, anyway, we'll get into some of the details of those. But I think what's important to note is, as of 2012, like the bidding had already started in 2011, we were actually starting to select winners for the assets that were being sold. And then as of this year, actually, they handed over the assets to the private sector. The payments, sort of been made. So I think what we have here is an opportunity to talk through some of those issues. So I'll let Fola introduce himself.
Hi guys, so my name is Fola Fagbule and I work with the Africa Finance Corporation in Lagos. And we finance infrastructure across the continent, and Nigeria obviously is a very important market for us. Power in Nigeria is the most important project for AFC. It's part of the reason why AFC was founded. And so we spend a lot of time working on it, even before it got to the point where it is today. And I think what I will just talk about in terms of the timeline to where we are today is some of the backstory about how ultimately privatization came to be. And Ayo, who will introduce himself as commissioner at the Electricity Regulatory Commission, will tell us more about this because he has a lot of insight into this as well. But I think the important thing to note is that perhaps 5 even years ago, maybe even less than that, privatization was a dirty word in Nigeria, particularly privatization of the power sector. It was not something that had a lot of support from many parts of the country. It was not an easy process. And I think for me, an important part of the case study up to where we are today is about how to make change happen in a country where there's been significant opposition to it from many sources, and how that change process was led. AFC was involved in that, but many other parties were involved. The International Finance Corporation played a major role. The Bankers Committee in Nigeria, I think, played a very important role, and this is a committee of bank CEOs in the country, and many other stakeholders who sort of came together to insist that this had to happen. and drove that change process all the way to securing the political support for it, and then eventually leading to the asset divestments that happened in the last 12 months. We're all excited about what's happened, and it's going to be a bumpy road going forward. I don't think it's done yet in terms of it being a success story. But the point is that it has happened, and it was very unlikely 5 years ago. And so I think that's my contribution to the backstory about the timeline that we have today.
That's great, thanks. Ali?
Or should I? Hi, my name is Abiodun Aino. I am an investment officer with the International Finance Corporation, or the IFC, part of the World Bank Group. For those of you who don't know, IFC you could look at as the private sector. It is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And within IFC, so I joined IFC last year, for example, and I'm part of the Infrastructure Africa team. Like Fola had said earlier, and thanks for your statements. Yes, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, set of reforms that has happened on at least in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know of any other one that even comes close. Before I go on, I want to go on record to say, Fola had said it earlier, but I really want to emphasize what he said. If you just look at the breadth of what has happened in the Nigeria power sector over the last 3-4 years, so the Power Sector Reform Act was passed in 2005. There were a couple of events that happened between then, and you probably see there's a sort of a break. So I mean, it's implied the upper right part of that timeline that says power reform re-established as national priority. So there was a change of government. There was a change. I mean, I won't go into all of that. But starting from 2010, with the presidential roadmap for power sector reforms, which tried to so EPSR. What was the EPSR trying to do? You could put it in 4 different buckets. So it was, first off, let us reorganize the power sector in Nigeria. So how do you do that? Before now, you had a vertically integrated utility, which Tomiwa said was never expect power always, right? So first off, break it off into a couple of generation, transmission, distribution. Reorganize it in a way that will increase transparency within the sector. So that was reorganization. Then you had regulation. Okay, so you're going to have private sector power, private sector generation, transmission, distribution. The Act also talks about creating a bulk trader, right? I mean, we'll go into all that in a bit. And then you have the regulatory part of it, which is where AO comes in. Then also, one thing that plagued the sector up to that point was that the pricing, the tariff in the industry just did not reflect the costs that you would need to incur to deliver reliable power to residential, industrial, commercial customers, right? So creating a tariff that reflects that, and then finally creating competition in the market, which is where the privatization comes in, which is where over time, so in the next couple of months, they're going to start what they actually call the transitional electricity market. Over time, that bulk trader goes away. Then you would ultimately, what the government is trying to do is to have competition within the industry, right? So where you have private sector owned generating companies, private sector owned distribution companies. You have NERC, you have AO and his folks, the regulators regulating the. He just told me the regulatees, right? So those 4 buckets are what the EPSR tried to do. I want to go on record to say that I mean it's been phenomenal, the amount of work, the amount of change that's happened. I want to congratulate AO for being a part of this. I think I was talking to a couple of friends at IFC who said, you guys have done, starting from the president, the minister, the erstwhile minister of power, the current minister of power, you're the head of NERC, the head of MBET, you guys have done a phenomenal job of which you can be most proud. And in fact, I'll actually start by, let me put it in context. Maybe I'm gushing too much. I shouldn't be gushing about it. I'm sure if you could blush, you would, but it probably is. So I joined IFC last year, and then my boss says, okay, power sector reform in Nigeria, this is our #1 priority. And even before I joined, I knew that was going to be one of the things I very desperately wanted to work on. He says, okay, let's put a set of slides together that just talks about the whole sector, everything that's been happening, where they're coming from, where they're going to. Literally one night at about 10 p.m., it just dawned on me. I just said, oh my goodness. I mean, look at all of these pieces that these guys have put together. The amount of work that has gone into this, the amount of thought that has gone into this. It's just phenomenal. Now, so just to bring it back here, and let me round up. Now, there's been a lot of work done. Is the process done? Absolutely not. It's a work in progress. There's still a lot more to be done. There's still a lot more work to be done. And I'm sure Ayo and his folks will continue to drink the 5-hour energy or whatever they do to keep their energy levels up. As over the next couple of months, the next couple of years will be even more critical than what has happened in the past. So again, we'll go into details on that, but that's my contribution. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name has been stated by Ayo Echo, and I work for the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Just a little bit of history before I go on. Thomas talked about NEPA in 1972. He didn't talk about PHCN in 2005, which was what NEPA became. And NEPA also has an acronym. The acronym also has a meaning. It's called, it was then, problem has changed name. So now that we've done that one, we can now go back to some serious business. Well, I work in there, and I am responsible for the economic side of what NEC does. Which is not to say that I'm an economist, I'm actually a lawyer, unfortunately. But NERC is the regulatory agency for Nigeria. We're responsible for all aspects of regulating the electricity sector. We were established in 2005 by the Power Sector Reform Act. There are 7 commissioners in NERC, I'm one of them. We are led by a chairman. All of us are executive. And we have this enormous task of just trying to essentially clear a path through territory that has not been trodden before. In Nigeria, regulation in Nigeria generally of any kind is still relatively new, comparatively new. It's still quite a different kind of animal, and we're mostly not used to it. But these are exciting times. These are times in which anybody who has an interest in the power sector would really want to be involved in the economy of Nigeria, quite frankly. And I, for one, regard myself as quite fortunate to be involved in this. I've been involved in the Nigerian power sector for something like 12, 13 years now. I used to work in the Bureau of Public Enterprises. I was in charge of the power sector reform team in the BPE when the policy was first written, when the law was first passed. That's a little bit of history that most of you, not all of you, don't know anything about. This act has been passed twice. It was passed in 2003. It wasn't assented to for political reasons by the president, and he let it lapse. And then it was passed again in 2005 when I suspect he was ready to implement the act. So as we'll be listening to, as we'll be understanding as we go along, privatization is probably 99% politics, and or maybe 99.9% politics and 0.01% economics. Really, at the end of the day, it's all about how you tie those political strands together. The economics of privatization is pretty straightforward. It's a no-brainer for anybody. It's the politics of which we talk self. But really, that's what we're talking about as we go along. Just a few words like everyone else I was trying to do. I think that 2 words would probably sum up the Nigerian power sector reform. And the words, it's a coinage from a friend of mine at the World Bank. She called it simultaneous sequentiality. It's just another word for juggling so many balls at the same time and making sure that not one of them drops. If we had to carry out the reform program the way you would classically want to do it, we probably would have taken 10, 11 years, probably have taken something like 21, 31 years, because you have to go one step after the other. But in Nigeria, you've had to do so many things at the same time. Unbundle, set up the tariff framework, set up rules for the market, begin the sale, persuade people that you really don't have to do too much due diligence, just go ahead and get the stuff. And then the market changes shape and we then go into a new phase, and it's all happening almost all at the same time. So that really in a nutshell is what I would characterize the Nigerian market, is how we characterize the Nigerian market. And I really look forward to this conversation that we'll have this afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mikhail Mikomarov. As you can tell by my name, I am not Nigerian. So that's one difference from seeing the rest of the panel here. I'm originally from Russia. I've spent my last 3.5 years having transferred to Africa. I'm based in the Johannesburg office of McKinsey. We have offices in Lagos, Rwanda, and a few other countries in Africa. And I deal exclusively in the power sector. I've worked in Nigeria both with the public sector and the private sector as well, and also did quite a bit of work with in other countries as well. And what I'd like to do is actually give a little bit of the perspective of how this fits into all of Africa. Because the issues that Nigeria has been facing are very similar to what most of sub-Saharan Africa is facing, which is, well, if we had this projector up, it would probably have been shut down 2 or 3 times already in Tanzania or in Nigeria. We wait for it to restart because the backup generators have come up. So that's a very, very typical issue. Access is a big issue, although Nigeria is probably about 2nd or 3rd on the continent in terms of that. So the challenges are very similar. What's different about Nigeria is how the country and the sector has gone about solving it. In a lot of countries, what we see is a short-term solution. Let's bring in more diesel generation. Let's solve for next year because the election is next year. So it is actually a political solution, but it's a short-term solution. What is interesting about Nigeria is it's going for a long-term solution, right? And this started, well, you can see here, it started actually a while ago. It's not on here, right? But certainly when the roadmap came out, and it was clear this was going to be a long-term process, that made a difference. And the government has maintained commitment to it despite all the other political pressures and pushes one way or the other. And I think what would be interesting at some point to discuss today is what's going to happen beyond 2013. Because while there's been a lot of good progress in terms of actually executing the privatization, a lot of issues have been solved. But if you think about it, people do not have more electricity today than they did a few years ago. In fact, they have less this year than they did last year. So how and that's the end goal, well, at least the economic end goal. So how will that happen? And I hope that at some point we can spend some time on that today.
Great. So you've heard their backgrounds, and we talked through some of the basic timelines and the backgrounds regarding this. I think one way to sort of kick this off is just to get a sense of how successful can this thing really be. There's a lot of interlinks. From the generation side to the distribution side, and now you have this bulk trader that's kind of unbalanced. So maybe, Abby, if you could sort of help us get started here, like how do you see some of the investments that need to be made, sort of like on different fronts, starting with as far upstream as the gas, that many of these thermal plants that dominate the market.
Thanks, Tomiwa. So again, lots has been done. Now, in the roadmap, primarily because of Nigeria's abundant resources, natural gas resources, the government decided, or at least the guys who put the roadmap together decided that gas-fired generation was going to be the primary fuel for, at least on the generation side, in the short, probably even medium term, okay? So And the idea there was you would have IPPs, you would have some of the companies that were privatized from NEPA, unbundled from NEPA. You would sell them to private sector individuals. They would refurbish those plants. They will expand them. So gas is critical here. Nigeria has what, the 7th, 8th largest reserves, proved and probable reserves of natural gas in the world. You know, you hear all sorts of numbers, 180, 184 TCF, somewhere there. Okay. Now, to support that, you know, it's one thing to have the resources in place. So gas initially in place. It's one thing to have that. It's another thing to have people willing to spend the money to get the gas out of the ground, processed and then made available to IPPs, to plants to use it. So one of the things the government did was they said, okay, you independent or international oil companies, we're going to give you, you know, you have a domestic supply obligation. Every year, the Minister of Petroleum Resources will tell you if you owned a field or you owned a license where you have lots of, you know, you have oil, you have, a lot of the oil in Nigeria is associated with gas. So where you're producing gas from a field, government every year, the Minister of Petroleum Resources will tell you, you need to produce or you need to provide this much gas for power generation purposes, at least, you know, maybe other, you know, they have some critical industries for power. That was the basic idea. Also, Nigeria has the Nigerian Gas Company that has always been there, part of an NPC, no need to go into an NPC, okay? So when we started looking at this sector, we said, well, the gas to power chain, that whole value chain, we need to look at this chain. So what's the government doing and how do we plug into it? First, we said, let us support. So a couple of, about January this year, the World Bank Group came up with what we call our energy business plan. Basically, a document that encapsulates how we intend to support the Nigerian power sector reforms, how we intend to plug into that. So we said, okay, we'll invest in IPPs. We'll help, basically we're trying to help catalyze the reforms. So we'll invest in generation, we'll invest in distribution, we will, you know, both on the privatization side and then in the, you know, the new oncoming IPP side. There is also a renewable energy component to that, but not much. But then the problem was, okay, so where is the gas going to come from? Only recently have we, you know, let's say, you know, say in the last couple of months, we said, where's the gas going to come from? Now, there is a gas master plan that the government has put in place, where he said, okay, this is a big plan. We'll create 3 central processing facilities. Each one probably cost, if you think of it, probably order $5 billion each. You know, everything very good theoretically. But then the reality on the ground is that all of those investments, a lot of those investments have not been made right now. Question is why? If you look at Nigeria, right? So if we had a map of the world up there, and you know, Africa will be probably somewhere between where Fola and Mikhail are, so somewhere in the middle there. Okay. Okay. So I'm where Asia will be, or Asia is, and then the United States will be AO. Okay. So
That's nice.
see, I just keep giving. Okay. So if you're an international oil company today, you look at the whole globe and you have oil and gas assets all over the place, okay? And you have a domestic supply obligation from your government. The government says, no, you have to invest in this. For you, it is an economic decision, mostly. I mean, part of it is, well, if I don't, then maybe the government will start to penalize me, they might kick me out. But if I do, how am I going to make money out of this? How does investing in the Nigerian gas market, how does that compare with me investing in Qatar or investing in Russia? I'll tell you why I'm mentioning those two in a second. So all of you, I'm sure, have heard a lot about shale. Oh, shale gas in the US, so the US is going to become an exporter of gas. Okay, so the US and Europe, I didn't mention where Europe was. Europe is somewhere in the black there, so somewhere in the north. US and Europe used to be the main off-takers of Nigeria's gas, mostly from LNG, but the US is not going to be going forward. Europe is probably going to be getting gas from Russia. So Asia remains the market. But then as an IOC, you're looking at the competition is Asia, but then, sorry, the market is in Asia. You're competing with Qatar and Russia to supply Asia with gas. Okay? There is a $2 per unit of gas produced. It's about $2 in transportation costs. delta between Nigeria and then those guys there. It's easier to get the gas from there. So for them, it's more of an economic thing. They'll say, yes, they have the domestic supply obligation. If I don't supply, I'll have to pay a penalty of $3.50 per unit. So for me, for the oil and gas companies, that's the comparison. But we at the World Bank have said, and right now, we are going to start trying to see how we can invest in that sector, whether it is by giving grants, all of this is all in flux. For example, there's one of the front-runner IPPs we're looking at right now. I won't mention the name. If I do, I'm sure most of you know them. I might have heard the name somewhere there. One of the challenges we're having now is, okay, who is going to supply them with gas? If that guy doesn't supply them with gas, is there a plan B? Is there a plan C? What would it cost, plan B and plan C, what would it cost to link a stranded gas field to just that plant? How much would it cost? And that's relatively short term. So I know I've talked a lot around this whole gas issue, but gas is definitely a weak link in what's going on. Now, it's a work in progress. I'm sure, you heard something on the order of $15, $20 billion has to be spent. Huge numbers. But what I was trying to do was give you some concrete reasons why those investments are yet to happen, and hopefully how people, because some of the solutions to that problem will need to, it can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. Some IPPs will just have to say, okay, how do I link myself to gas fields? Do I sit there and wait for the petroleum industry bill and the gas master plan to be put in place and for the $50, $60 billion to be spent? What if that doesn't happen? I would just end up having a stranded asset that doesn't have gas supplying it. So people will need to think creatively about how to provide gas to their plants. And then on the macro side, like I said, the World Bank, IFC, we're also thinking about what we can do to help solve that chain. Another key, did you just talk about gas, or do you want to go into, weak links?
You can let me, I was actually going to ask Kyle.
About the other, okay, so I think I've talked enough.
No, so I think that's actually a good way to sort of look at it, right? So we're still talking about the gas side of things. But I think it's also important to know that some of the contingencies that Abby mentioned would be necessary. So, like when you start thinking second level, how do I link a stranded load? There are going to be costs involved. So there are also other ways to sort of think about this whole system. So Mikhail, I was just wondering if you can sort of touch on your thoughts on how the bulk trader is sort of set up to help, in some ways bridge, whatever the efficiencies in the short term might be in terms of just trying to get the market to actually become fully competitive and sort of sustainable. I think that might be helpful to sort of start painting the picture down the road as well.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so one of the challenges in any sector is, once you kind of have the unbundling, you have your generation companies here, and you have your transmission company here, and you have your distribution companies here, and they're the ones who are selling to the customers. How do you actually create the fact that each one of these, right, each one of these pieces of the value chain is dependent upon the one in front of them? And this is really the challenge when you have unbundling and when you also have different entities responsible. Because you would think, that's actually why in a lot of countries, when they start off with, they have a monopoly, because it's much easier to have just everything be decided by one. So how do you have a situation where now everybody is different and everybody has different priorities? How do you actually create a system that works? That these guys can actually pay, that distribution companies can collect and pay for the transmission, pay for the generation, which then has to be able to pay for the gas. All of that has to work. And so this is where, a lot of actually the issues came up. Just dividing it and selling the assets was easy. How do you create a system that works? And that's actually where you have a bulk trader who can create that link, that bridge between who is generating and then who is selling or distributing. And that's really where they come in and actually create that link. The challenge is in that, and so I'll just add on to, gas is a challenge. And you've heard that there's investments in gas, and we've talked about how that could happen. There is investments in generation, there is investments in distribution, great privatization is solving that. The link in the middle, from a physical asset point of view, which is not covered by the bulk trader, but this is the transmission company. And here, this is, in my opinion, where actually the huge bottleneck at the moment in the country is located, where you have all of this potential capacity that could come online, the assets are there, okay? In some cases, we don't have gas, but we can link the gas. We can increase the price, create an environment where there'll be investments to build those pipelines. But then what? We have the distribution companies who have a mandate to, improve their efficiencies based upon the sale, and they're trying to improve that. But they need the electricity to connect to the people. They need the electricity to actually expand their networks. That's not getting to them. That is not getting them. It's not getting them because we don't have generation. It's not getting them because of transmission, because the grid is insufficient, because the grid cannot handle the additional capacity, and everybody's talking about let's bring on more and more capacity, more and more ribbons are cut, but none of it is going to get to distribution companies until the transmission issue is solved. And that's going to be an issue for the whole balancing, right? Because the whole system depends upon each other. So unless electricity goes all the way through, money is not going to come back through the other way. And this is, I think right now, actually the challenge that's keeping the energy getting to the people.
Thanks for that.
Can I say something?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Aya. Hopefully we can continue our love fest though.
Right. It's not to, the picture could sometimes look the proverbial half full, half empty cup. And what both Biodo and Mikhail have tried to put in very simple summary terms is really the challenge going forward. I think that the real issue we'll have to deal with, and the period of time which we'll have to deal with that issue, or those two issues, is really the next 12 to 15 months. This is probably going to be the most delicate period for the sector going forward. But I'm not so sure that it's as bad as it looks. And this is not trying to put a plus on things. It's just trying to say that there are options that could be brought in over time. And as these options are being discussed, they also present opportunities. Transmission is indeed a challenge. It's not a challenge, not just merely in the physical sense, but also in the strategic sense. In the sense of, we actually spend quite a bit of time trying to work out a plan for what to do about generation and distribution, the opposite end of the transmission grid. But we spend a lot less time working out the solution for transmission beyond saying that we have a management contract in place. And there are reasons for that. 12, 11 years ago, when policy was being discussed, the most acrimonious discussions were over the future of the gas sector, the gas to power market, and the transmission market. And it was simply all about vested interests. So policymakers have to make a conscious decision as to which battles to fight and which to defer to another day. And the two battles that were deferred for another day were transmission and gas. And I guess that those chickens have come home to roost now. Because here we are, we've done what we needed to do in generation and in distribution, and we now have to deal with these challenges. In transmission, what NERC has done is to put in place a framework for something we call embedded generation, which here in the US you call distributed generation. And that's simply saying that rather than relying on the grid, you look for small packages of 10, 15, 20 megawatts and just link them up directly to the distribution subsystem, and you bypass the transmission grid. Now, that's not the solution that you can put into effect across the country, but you can certainly put it into effect in those 2 or 3 distribution companies that essentially constitute or take up about something like 40-50% of the nation, where the industrial and commercial customers who you want to serve very quickly and keep them within the distribution grid, and where they are to be found. That's the southwest area largely, and some parts of the north where you have significant industrial concentrations. So in the short term, I believe strongly that the framework we put in place for embedded generation is going to play a significant role in easing some of the tension that you have from not being able to say that the transmission grid is reliable. Now, the bulk, on the other hand, the bulk trader, one shouldn't be too sanguine about the bulk trader. Why? Yes, the bulk trader is the proverbial man in the middle. And the reason why we take the bulk trader seriously is because the bulk trader is backed by finance. To a certain degree. There's only so much that a guarantor can do about plugging gaps before the guarantor itself needs to be guaranteed. All right? So, really, the true solution to the bulk trader, and I'll say this, the bulk trader is actually a transient entity. It's not designed to be in this market over the medium term. It's actually designed to be in the market during the short term when the fundamental objective of the privatization, which was to deal with the distribution problem. For anybody who knows how electricity works, all money comes from distribution. None of us pays money to a generating plant. None of us pays money to a transmission company. We pay money to a distribution company. That entity that serves us in our homes, and that's where all the money comes from. And the crux of the privatization in Nigeria was how do we solve the transmission, the distribution problem? Not how do we solve the generation problem, not how do we solve the transmission problem, but how do we solve the distribution problem? Because once you are able to cut those losses to tolerable limits, then of course you're able to have distribution companies entering into PPAs for more energy to come into the grid, and then begin to create a virtuous cycle. So the bulk trader is essentially an entity that buys time for those that have bought over the distribution companies to clean up the collection challenge that they have over the 2-3 years that we expect the bulk trader will be around 4, and then begin to contract for power on their own. So initially, any procurement of energy in Nigeria will be done largely by the bulk trader, perhaps by 1 or 2 of the distribution companies which are already approaching creditworthiness to some degree, and will probably be creditworthy in the next 12 months. But certainly, the bulk trader in the short term is going to be the only credible buyer of energy going forward. And then 15, 18 months from now, you see more distribution companies becoming buyers. But I mean, when I say becoming buyers for energy from the grid, but immediately, right now, going forward, they're going to have distribution companies buying energy on their own accounts at the embedded level. So small packages, 5, 10, 15, 20 megawatts, $6, $7, $8, $10 million projects to connect energy, which of course doesn't say that that solves the problem, because they then have their own fuel supply problem, all right? But that's easier to do. You've got CNG, put gas into big bottles and transport them. They're already, the CNG business already, it's already beginning to show signs of a big boom going forward. And that's likely in the southwest and in some parts of the southeast area of the country. So there are solutions to the problem. And it promises to be quite interesting to see how those solutions will play themselves out.
So for some of you that are not familiar with the term, CNG is compressed natural gas. I'm hoping many of you here are. And IPP is just like independent power plants. But I think that's actually a good segue into sort of the next level of the discussion. Fola, I know your company has invested in a distribution asset. So maybe what would help us sort of clarify that in the picture is just if you sort of walk us through how you think about the business and how you mitigate some of the risks that AU has started laying out the foundations for.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks, Tomura. AFC has invested in one of the distribution companies that was sold. In addition to that, I'll just say that we have also provided financing to 2 of the generation companies that were also sold. One of them is a hydro plant. We've talked a lot about gas, but Nigeria also has significant baseload hydro power supply. We have invested in one of the largest ones. In addition to that, we've also financed one of the gas-fired plants. Specifically about distribution, I think we've tried to talk about what are the investments that need to be made in order to ensure that power supply improves to the ordinary folks. Ultimately, that's the objective of the entire process. And the only way to really measure success is power delivered to the homes of people on a reliable, consistent basis. So some of the investments that the company that we have invested in are going to be making are those investments that lead to reducing particularly non-technical losses. And so the situation up until now has been that most of the distribution companies have suffered from so-called aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses. The basis upon which the asset was secured in the first place, apart from paying the bid price, was to make a commitment to reducing those loss levels. In other words, to becoming a more efficient operator. And ultimately, in the sector as a whole, efficiency is sort of the Bible. Efficiency is the key to success. And that's part of what NEC is going to help achieve, is ensuring efficiency across the value chain. And so the primary objective of this investment for us in the next few years, as well for everyone else who's purchased a distribution company, is going to be to increase efficiency levels to the utmost possible amount. Technical losses are more difficult to resolve, given the nature of the electricity business and the energy that is lost between generation through transmission to distribution. But clearly, commercial losses in form of losses due to monies not being collected even though power has been supplied, customers not being appropriately metered and hence not paying on time, and any number of other commercial type losses, those are going to be focused on with great zeal in the next 18 months. And I think some of the immediate improvements that you will begin to see in the sector, apart from just basic customer service that will improve, is in terms of the power that is being generated, being supplied to customers who do pay for it. And I think that's the first kind of change that will happen. Ultimately, you will see investments in metering and in ensuring that we are calculating more accurately what is being supplied to people. We will see investments to reduce theft levels across the distribution franchise. You will see any number of investments of that nature for quick wins to reduce losses and to improve efficiency. So I think that's where distribution companies are going in the short term. In the long term, then we'll begin to see more investments in expanding access to more customers across the distribution franchise. And I guess to summarize, it is true that it's going to take a while for us to see a power sector in Nigeria that is the dream of every Nigerian, which is to have electricity all of the time. And that's how it should be. It's going to take a while to get there, but we're going to see improvements in the very short run. We are very entrepreneurial people in Nigeria, and private sector particularly, once people's money is on the line, you find that they begin to behave in a very, very efficient way. And you can expect to see a lot of efficiency come online in a very, very short time frame.
Thank you very much for that, for us. So I think it's safe to say, to sum it up, a lot's been done in the Nigerian power sector. There's still a lot more to be done, and I think they have the framework in place to start pushing at the boundaries a little bit and actually improving the sector. The jury's still out on when we'll actually start to see some of those benefits. But I think what we're going to do here is open it up to the audience. We have less than 30 minutes left, so keep your questions to be questions. We have the experts at the table, they will provide the answers. And then, if you could direct your questions based on their backgrounds or what you've heard, I think that would be very helpful as well. I saw your hand go up first, so that's the gentleman in the back. And just briefly state your name.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel. I just have a question which is about the workers of NEPA, right? What is going to be done? On one hand, you have engineers who understand the system. On the other hand, you have people who you're privatizing and they're saying you want to fire all of us. So how you go? I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what's going to happen. And I mean, on the other hand, also you have people who are in the system who, I mean, for example, the building I was staying in when I was back in Nigeria, we're paying for 6 bills, and there was only one NEPA line into the building. You have people who are in the system who are literally tearing down the distribution system, right? And they're the staff. So what's going to be done with the people who work there?
Yeah, I think I'll let Ayo answer that question.
Sure.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think I was going to answer that. All right. By the way, it's not NEPA. It's here. It's the project. Where do you live in Nigeria?
Lagos.
Okay, which part of Lagos? Okay, so you're a co-distribution company. That's the name of your company, the company that serves you. And hopefully in another 3 or 4 years when you do an IPO, you'll probably be a shareholder there also. The workers of, let me use the word, NEPA, The proceeds from privatization amounted to something like $3 billion. Every cent has been paid to them. The first big dividend payout from the power sector went to the workers. They were basically bought off. Naturally, there were going to be redundancies, and Nigerian labor law requires, like in every other country, that when redundancies are going to have to be effected, workers have to be paid off. I think one of the secrets, one of the things that will forever remain secret in Nigeria is the manner in which the calculations for paying off workers were done. But essentially, $3 billion was paid to something like 47,000 people. That's a lot of money. And that's one of the reasons why you have this success that we have. I said earlier on that privatization is 99% politics and 1% economics. That's the 1% of that's the economics in the 1% which nobody understands. But politically, a key stakeholder group that needed to be managed very carefully were the workers. When Rwanda brought in the private sector a few years ago, they walked in one day. Rwanda is basically a hydro country, and the dams were empty. The workers opened up the stopcocks and water just flowed out. So that wouldn't happen in Nigeria, we had to take care of the workers. And it's a question which will probably be argued forever. Was it worth it? Should they have been confronted and dealt with? The law could have dealt with them. There are ample laws in Nigeria to deal with worker revolts and strikes and lockouts and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, we're talking about electricity here. We're talking about something which in the first place is not even enough for everybody, talk less of having it all go completely. So a political decision was taken, and it was manage them carefully and take care of them and give them whatever it is they want, even if it's unreasonable. And that's what happened in Nigeria. So all the workers have been taken care of. They've cashed out big time from this market, and we have what we have.
Great. I'll take an email if there's one. If not, I'll take it.
One of the few benefits of a nationally owned electric industry is stable prices. So when you privatize the industry, you open up the entire industry to the volatility of the market. So my question is, how has that been reflected in the prices that people are paying, especially consumers, end-use people? So just the entire chain all the way down from commercial, industrial, and residential customers.
Okay, I think that's good. I think
Is that me again?
No, I'll actually let Paula take it so you can catch your breath and drink some water.
See, all I'm doing is passing the mic back and forth.
I'll take a stab at it, although just as soon as Aya is done drinking water, he should answer the question because he's actually in charge of prices for the country.
Rates.
Yeah. So, but I'll take a stab at it from the point of view of someone who's investing in the sector. It's important for not just for the consumer, actually, but also for the financier, for there to be some kind of stability in terms of prices over the long run. I don't believe it's quite accurate that one of the benefits of a nationally owned electricity sector is stability in prices, nor do I believe that volatility is a necessary outcome of private investment in the power sector. I think the key is having a system that is appropriately regulated and where price guidance is very clear to everyone involved over the long run. So Ayo will tell us about the so-called multi-year tariff order, which is a well thought out system that's been developed in order to provide exactly what you're saying, which is some indication of how prices will be set over the medium to long term. Yes, it is true that there will be potential for price increases to happen, and there are provisions for, in particular, protecting the lowest income people from having to suffer from undue price increases. This has been thought through, and so a system does exist for setting prices over the long run. It's very important, and again, I will defer to A on this, for us not to have a situation where the consumers are unduly taken advantage of by electricity generators and utilities in the country. And we've seen that happen in other parts of the world, in other parts of Africa as well, when there was undue power given to generators and utilities. But I'll if you permit me, pass it to you.
So I think that's great. So I think what I would like you to do is maybe just give us some idea of what thinking went into setting up the MITO. What thinking into like the background around setting up the tariffs.
Okay. Like for that, I think that the two basic assumptions in the question are eminently arguable about whether nationally owned utilities actually promote stability. They do promote stability, but they're going downwards. Because the one that politicians will not want to do is raise prices. And that's what we saw in Nigeria. For 61 years until June last year, we never had economic pricing for energy in Nigeria, for electricity in Nigeria. And one of the major consequences of that was that there was no investment. Okay. The second point is also arguable about volatility, therefore resulting from the fact that you price volatility resulting from the fact that you have private sector players coming. And that's essentially what MITO has tried to do. What MITO is basically a framework that enables, as simply as I can state it, that enables players in the market at the three key levels, generation, transmission, and distribution, to recover, I'm quoting here, their reasonable costs, their prudent costs of doing business, and also return the profit. As a matter of fact, the Power Sector Reform Act in Nigeria specifically requires that NERC determines a tariff methodology that enables all players in the market to recover their costs and to make a profit over and above those costs. So, of course, the devil is always in the detail. The question is, what is a reasonable and prudent cost? All right, and what is the reasonable margin of profit? Now, what MITO has done has been to take a look at the market, determine certain building blocks in the industry. You need to make a return on your capital, you need to recover
Fuel cost.
a return on your investment itself, and then you need to cover your costs. Those two key building blocks. And then looking at other comparative markets allow what is meant to be a reasonable return. And I think the mere fact that we've got this buy-in from the distribution companies seems to indicate that we've sort of calibrated it maybe just right, or maybe enough to be able to bring people into the sector. Now, how do we deal with volatility? Two basic tools, which we call the minor and the major reviews. The minor review is carried out semi-annually, and it looks essentially at key variables in macroeconomic indices, exchange rates, inflation, interest rates. It also looks at the price of natural gas, which is not anything that we affect directly, it's just simply a pass-through. So far, because natural gas costs have been controlled, they've remained where they are, but by the beginning of next year, they will simply go wherever it is the market indicates they go to. So every 6 months, we look at these indices with another key variable today, which is a temporarily important variable, and that's the amount of energy that we have in the market. Anybody that knows Nigeria going forward knows that our energy stock, if I may use that phrase, changes significantly from time to time. And so we have to allow for that consequence for that to have a direct consequence on the price of the market. The more energy you have naturally as a volume business, the more stable your prices are, or the lower your prices are. And the less energy you have, the more your prices go up, which is a bit of an interesting phenomenon when you have to look at prices. But we're also able, one of the interesting things about tariffs is how you design them and how you bring them into the market to play. MITRE it gives you a 5-year window into the market. So I've talked about the minor review. The major reviews are carried out every 5 years, and at that point in time, you look at every single variable, every single technical economic assumption outside the minor review indices that I just talked about. And so you look at capacities, you look at plant efficiencies generally in the industry, and you use that to set a benchmark, all right, for pricing, particularly at generation level, which then feeds into transmission and distribution. So today in the Nigerian market, we've got two types of generation pricing models for the existing plant, which are just privatized. We call them the legacy plant. Their prices indicatively are something like, you can convert that into dollars at 157 to 1, something like 10 naira odd per kilowatt hour. And for what we call the new entrants, it's about 11, for 2013, it's about 11 naira, just slightly more than 11 naira per kilowatt hour. Now that changes, and then we set those tariffs going forward for the next 5 years, so that if you were to sign up for the PPA in, say, 2012 or 2014, I'm sorry, you just look at the MITRE model and plug in the price for 2014 with changes being affected on that price by changes in macroeconomic indices from year to year. So today, we're kind of a tariff review right now in Nigeria, and it looks like, believe it or not, generation prices have actually come down, because macroeconomics have been pretty good in Nigeria. Interest rates have been much lower than we projected them to be. Exchange rates have been much lower than we projected them to be. And so the direct effect of that is that we nominally have to reduce the tariff for generation. But when you look at the level, he has a very straight look on his face. But when you look at the level of energy that we've had coming to the market, it's a lot lower than we projected. And so while generation will remain stable, distribution would probably have to increase prices, all right, because we have less energy. And so we're looking at the tariff increase. But then we did a major review, started a major review 2.5 years ago, and it concluded last year. And we had what we call MITRE 2 coming to the market. But Fola and his people have come into the market, and we made a promise that, look, we will take a look again at some of the numbers that we had for losses. We revalidate those losses, because in some cases we just simply work on the rule of thumb and plug in the numbers. Now, when we do that review sometime early next year, we may end up having to do another major review earlier than we projected, something like 2 years earlier than we projected. And that's fine, as far as the law is concerned, because the law also says that while you should do a major review every 5 years, you can do one earlier than the 5th anniversary of the last one, if conditions in the market dictate that's what you should do. So you basically have these two mechanisms, these two tools for trying to keep a lead on price volatility. Now, I talked about tariff design and the consequences, for instance, of what has happened with generation. You don't necessarily have to, because you have a 5-year window, when and how you enable a player in the market to recover all its costs could be something that you look at on a futuristic basis. So if I know, for instance, that I'm going to have a lot more energy coming in next year, I might want to put most of that tariff increase in coming next year, because then I have a lot more energy coming in, and so it could more or less even out the impact of having a tariff increase that you would ordinarily have if you had less energy into the market. But that really involves a lot of give and take between the regulator and the market. And that's something that would worry some people about the dependence of the regulator, because then we're also under pressure. And that reminds me about something that I was going to make a note of. You know, we also look at economics, market power and all that, and we think that market power is in the hands of those distribution companies which are largely monopolies. In fact, they are all monopolies. But no, another way to look at it is to look at the AFCs of this world, who have 15% here and 20% there and 10% in the other place. and they own everything across the board, but they are all below the radar. So they're actually the ones that have significant market power in the Nigerian market. But really, that's how, MITO is basically a tool for managing price volatility.
Great, thank you very much for that.
I just want to. Okay, so how much do you pay for gas in DC right now?
I don't have a gas bill, I don't know.
No, I mean gas for your car. I assume that you drive, maybe.
I also don't have a car.
I think everyone paid,
So he's very clearly making it very difficult for me. But all I was trying to do is this. So if you look at what they are trying to do, what NERC is trying to do is similar to what the market does in the oil and gas industry in the US, right? Where you don't have someone sitting at the EIA or the DOE determining what the prices are. The market does that, right? So all MITO is, like I said, building blocks. So it is, what costs do you need? So what are your allowable costs, right? What costs will AU allow you to spend? Add that to every year you consume. When you use your car, you use, the car that you don't own right now. I hope you get one. So it depreciates over time. So you add that, and then what he says is a reasonable cost of capital. You add that to that, right? So that's, like allowable revenues for the industry. And then you divide that by the number of units of power generated. So, X gigawatt hours. And you say that number is your tariff, what you spend. Okay? Now, compare that to what people, so you move around the US, prices of gas keep doing that. But over time, it's usually between $2 and $4 per gallon, so somewhere there. What I was trying to bring out is prices change. The problem with having one body just saying, okay, it's going to stay stable for 20 years is that a lot of times the prices will probably never go down. And like you said, and in fact, when he said the prices actually will go down at some point, I was smiling because, if you just look at that little equation I was talking about, so anything that increases the denominator, right, will reduce that price. Okay, just very simply, increases the number of units available should decrease the price, all else being equal. Anything that if what's up there, if the numerator increases, then the tariff increases. So that's just an easy way to look at it. And then, sorry, I was wanting to add something to, I think there was a question earlier about, employees, what's to be done. Things like technology, for example. So maybe the followers of this world who are investing in the discos, maybe they'll put their transformers up on a pole as opposed to the transformer being down there, or maybe they'll put the meters up on a pole, which makes it more difficult to access. Information technology, stuff like that, right? So, we are talking about investors, people who have money to lose, but, they're not in the business, they're not the Red Cross, right? So,
So and just to clarify, PPA, again, if you don't know, it's just the power purchase agreement, and that's the document that the name implies. By the way, if all I use is this word pregnant, they've invested, so they're literally pregnant. And,
Yes, indeed.
That's something. I see, looking for, okay, there you go.
Hi, I guess just building on what you said, Ayo, on the new entrance on the MITO. So assuming that, because given the fact that we know that sometimes if a new entrant is coming to the market, you have to kind of invest a lot in the grid in terms of evacuating the capacity onto the additional capacity onto the grid. And also we have to think about the pipelines, right? Getting the gas to the new IPP. How do we compensate the sponsors, the investors, for this additional investment? Because it's quite significant. It's like north of 100 million. So how would you compensate for that under the MITO?
And so we have very limited time, so I'll take that question. I'm not sure if we'll have time for one more, but Ayo, if you could just respond very quickly, please.
The investor does not need to spend on large capacity transmission to his plant. That's essentially the responsibility of the fuel supplier, of gas supplier. And he recovers that cost through his price. All right, basically. Now, what we do is to let that price through. And like I said earlier, gas is a pass-through. But the rub again in that is that not everything is a pass-through. Your pricing still has to be reasonable. And I'll give you a graphic example of this. Sometime last year, one of the new IPPs coming to the market came to us with a financial model that we looked at. And we interrogated that model and saw that in there was an allowance made for malaria treatment for the workers of the gas company. Of course, we said that was crazy and that wasn't going to go through. It wasn't a significantly huge number, to be honest, but that's the kind of thing that would look at, as to what is good and what is not. It's basically a subjective judgment, but you do have a set of indicative costs for most infrastructure projects today, so you can basically tell to a few 100,000, maybe a few million per unit what a particular project should cost, and that's what you're looking for, really, to try and fit things into your typical boxes and allow and minimize the number of special cases that you find. There will always be special cases, but you want to minimize those. So really, fuel costs are the responsibility of the fuel supplier, and he gets that through his supply price.
That's great. So I've seen two hands here, and I think I'll let you go. And please make it a question.
Yes. What are the key takeaways for other African countries?
Yeah.
Very good question. So maybe Mikhail, I think you can the right context. You can just chime in.
Sure.
And that's a very good question, because that's actually the point of this panel is transfer. So I like that as around that. But
Do you all do one, or do I summarize for everyone? I mean, certainly one key takeaway is this is a long process, right? You saw the timeline, and we're not there yet. So countries need to actually think about this as a long-term plan, and when they do their subsidy planning, right? So the Ministry of Finance needs to know this is going to be a long-term plan. It's not a 1 or 2 year investment. The communication to the population, to the voters, must be, this is not going to be a quick win. You're not going to see results next year, but you will see results. And certainly, that's one. Second is, stay consistent with what your plan is. The reason why the glass is half full is because the government has done what it has said it would do, right? So the assets, when the bids have come in, they have been reviewed. The reviews have been announced, maybe a week or two late, but they have been announced. When the money was given, the assets have been handed over, right? There's always tension whether or not it's going to happen. But basically, what has been laid out in the power sector reform roadmap has been happening. Maybe a little bit late, but all of those things have been happening. So the government is actually producing on its promises, which is helping international investors thinking, okay, if I'm going to put in money, I know that the next steps will also happen. So that's number two. And there's probably a third one that's also very important, which is just cost-reflective tariff. Is not an easy thing, but it must happen, because otherwise the sector will not be financially sustainable.
awesome. Thank you very much.
Just
I
one-
think I'll
Can I
just
add something?
okay.
Very quickly, you really also need to take into account the fact that most of the companies that you want to sell, if not all of them, have huge liability. And so if you want to make them attractive in some form or the other, you need to find some way to deal with those liabilities. What we did in Nigeria was just simply take them off the balance sheets of the company and put them into something called the Nigeria Electricity Liability Management Company. You need to look at that. The other thing, and the carry question is, but it's really critical here, is the political will to just push through. It will ebb and it will flow, but it needs to be there all the time. And whatever it is needs to be done. And in Nigeria, it was done by a combination of the private sector putting pressure on the government, along with a few technocrats in government also just keeping at it. Which brings to the third point. I said something earlier on about simultaneous sequentiality and every reform process involving a number of steps, which, if you really look at it, you can't afford, given the short election cycles that we have, which are a reality that we must live with. You can't afford to have these processes happening consecutively. They have to happen simultaneously, even though in some cases they were not designed that way. So simultaneous sequentiality is something that's very critical, and that requires a team, a core team of technocrats who are dedicated to their work. but who also have to be able to have that thing that most technocrats don't have, which is being able to work with, to be aware of, and to work with the political sensibilities of the environment in which they exist. So you must have technocrats who have a little bit of political news about what it is they do. I think if you ask me, those three things are also adding to the mix. It's a big part of things you have to put together and hope that what comes out works. But you know, there are those things also to take into account.
Okay, that's good. Hopefully you can address your question even to the last two people, or you wouldn't come to the above. What was your question?
Yes, my question is about captive power. I know that's one we've not discussed a lot. There's an obvious need for companies to reduce their costs by going captive, but how do you balance that against basically captive power cherry picking the best and most creditworthy customers in the East Coast?
So the off-grid recognition, that's a good question. That's one I had as well. I don't know if Abby or Paula wants to.
Yeah. So I think
If you could just explain what captive power is.
well, captive power is, I think Eya talked about it earlier, a small plant, he called it embedded generation. A small plant within, say, a distribution franchise that generates power and sells it, doesn't have to transmit it over long distances. In some cases, sells it to one single customer. Cherry picking was a big issue in the past, I think. It still is a major issue. The reason it was an issue was because the government wanted to maintain the viability of the distribution companies. They didn't want the best customers to have been, as you say, cherry-picked, and then only the less valuable customers were left. That's not the case anymore because the distribution companies have now been sold. And so embedded generation is, I guess, what it's now called. And I think that's something that is in the best interest of the country as a whole. There are regulations around it, and you have to follow the rules to be able to do it. As long as the rules are upheld, and as long as NERC remains a strong regulator, which is the most important thing for the growth of this sector, I think embedded generation is going to be a useful contributor.
Okay, so we're out of time. That guy that asked that question stole my thunder. Really, the whole idea here was, what can we take from this experience in Nigeria? How can we transform that, beyond that country and sort of look at the continent and say, what can we pick from this that worked? What didn't work so well, and how can we help improve the power situation in Africa in general? So with that, I would like to give a big round of applause to our...
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to point out a couple things. We're passing out some surveys. We really value your feedback to improving the conference next year and the panels as well. We'll let you know the next set of panels will be starting at 4:05 p.m.